Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jelani Cobb, and I have the pleasure of being the Dean of Columbia Journalism School. And I'm really excited to welcome you all here today for this very vital and magnificently titled discussion of subpoenas and shoe leather, how prosecutors and investigative journalists pursue public corruption. The topic reminded me of a conversation I had once with a longtime political activist in New Orleans. He was talking about the city and he said, New Orleans has been corrupt since it was a trading post. And I thought that was a really interesting way of contextualizing, the subject matter there. New York City has its own very long history of dealing with questions of public corruption and office holder corruption in a variety of different capacities. We find ourselves at a very unique moment in terms of the investigation of the sitting mayor, as well as the shift that's happening between presidential administrations and what all this could portend and how this will play out both in the courtrooms and in the newsrooms. And so we're pleased to have with us Errol Lewis, who is going to moderate this discussion. And just before I go, I would like to say thank you to everyone at Vital City. This is the second of our collaborations with the Vital City team for a conversation like this. And so particularly Elizabeth Glazer and Josh Greenman, who we've had the pleasure of working with to put these forums and discussions together. And so I'm going to bow out and place this in the capable hands of Errol Lewis, who will then introduce the panel, and the discussion will go from there. Thank you. Errol?
Thank you very much, Dean Cobb, and I want to welcome everybody who chose to join us. I'm looking forward to a great and spirited discussion. I'm Errol Lewis, the political anchor at Spectrum News New York One. I'm also a contributing writer for Vital City and have enjoyed working with them over these last couple of years as they've gotten off the ground and really gotten off to a great running start, providing really interesting analysis and commentary and facts to help us make sense of a sometimes confusing situation here in the city. I am pleased to introduce our panel. The four panelists have extensive biographies, but I'll just give you sort of the top line. Rose Gill is a principal with Bloomberg Associates and formerly served as a commissioner of the Department of Investigation for the City of New York. Mimi Rocha is the district attorney of Westchester County for a few weeks more, at least, and a former assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. Willie Rashbaum is a New York Times reporter covering the courts, political corruption, and other law enforcement topics. And Greg Smith is a reporter at the City, a longtime reporter, investigative reporter at the New York Daily News. You may have seen a lot of his work both on political corruption in the courts, as well as New York City Housing Authority and related issues. So I want to thank you all for being here. We're going to talk for quite a while. But along the way, we will certainly welcome your questions and comments. There's the Q&A square at the bottom of your screen. I would urge you to direct all of your comments and questions there. Some people inevitably end up using the chat, and that's fine too. I'd only ask that you direct any comments that make their way into the chat toward the panelists and not start side discussions there, so we can have one good, smooth, unified conversation. So panelists, thank you very much for joining me. And I want to start with Mimi and Rose Gill and sort of just set the scene, in part because Damian Williams is leaving as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District at the end of this week. And I guess more broadly speaking, to what extent is the U.S. Attorney, or frankly, the District Attorney, able to set the tone for what will or won't be tolerated or investigated? Discretion, of course, is your most powerful tool, Mimi Rocha. What's your sense of what the SDNY under Damian Williams has been trying to do as far as setting a standard when it comes to public integrity.
Thanks, Daryl, and it's great to be here with everyone. So I think that Damien, who in full disclosure, I know well and actually supervised him his very first day in the office, which makes me feel really old many years ago. I think Damien has really sort of upheld what has been the standard in my experience, my 17 years in the office, and then watching it, from outside the office, which is to bring the cases, often the cases that we first get leads from, read about in the papers, hear on the news about, no matter who the subject target of those cases is. Does not matter in the same way, that I think it shouldn't matter whether a judge is appointed by a particular president. I think the U.S. attorneys in the Southern District of New York have carried on this very important and good tradition and principle of no matter who, appointed me, who gave me this opportunity, if a case presents itself where I see possible illegal conduct, we're going to pursue it. And clearly, Damien has lived up to that in bringing cases against fellow Democrats, if you will. Putting aside whatever Damien's politics are, he was appointed by a Democratic administration. So I think he has really done an amazing job of living up to that standard. And I know we'll sort of discuss what's to come, but I think
Mhm.
that's the table setting for now.
And in part, Mimi, because there are always lots of cases or potential cases. Thinking back to your time, say in the Southern District, you well, you have to make choices as a prosecutor, an office as the office as a whole, and individual prosecutors, and certainly the U.S. attorney, about what might be seen as, say, representative cases in the securities context. There are a lot of cryptocurrency fraudsters out there, but he chose Sam Bankman-Fried. There are a lot of people who do a lot of different things, but you do have to make choices. And that's done with an eye toward trying to let people know what you do consider serious, right?
Sure. I mean, as you said at the beginning of your question, discretion is important, maybe the most important tool that prosecutors have. I don't think that, I think a lot of the complaints about people who feel they've been targeted, quote unquote, by prosecutors are actually the very practical result of the fact, as we're here to discuss, that high publicity people in the public eye, whether they be elected officials or not elected officials, do get more scrutiny from press and people who I define that broadly, and so prosecutors do read about and get leads on cases to pursue. And obviously, if someone is in the public eye, it is more of an example setting case than if it is not an individual in public eye. And I know that's seen as a negative, right? It's termed targeting, but it's actually the very practical result of the fact that people in the public eye, for whatever reason, whether it be because they've been enormously successful at a very young age and made a lot of money, like Sam Bankman-Fried, or whether it be because they're a mayor of New York or something, they're just going to get more scrutiny, and that is a legitimate reason, I think, for prosecutors to choose to bring one case over another if that is a choice they're making.
And Rose Gill, as we make our way toward talking about the particular case in New York, I wanted you to actually clarify something, not with regard to the actual case at hand, but in general, the Department of Investigation is kind of an odd animal within city government, right? The commissioner is a mayoral appointee, but it also requires approval by the city council, serves a term that is not in sync with the rest of the political cycle, and can only be removed for cause. They also do a lot of background checks, so they have a lot of access to particular kinds of data. Explain kind of, in your opinion, and in your experience, where the DOI fits into investigations of public integrity.
Well, I mean, obviously, that is its sole focus. You know, it is a law enforcement agency that, unlike, for example, the FBI, is not also doing, you know, the kinds of cases that are in the papers every day. They're not doing organized crime. They're not doing securities fraud. It is just about municipal corruption, plain and simple. One difference about DOI is that and, you know, I work with all the other agencies in conducting investigations while I was at DOI. They finish a case and move on, and that's not a criticism. DOI finishes an investigation, there'll be an outcome, it might be an arrest, it might be a conflict of interest referral, it might be an administrative penalty. Very often criminal referrals would take place, but we would then stay behind with the agency that had the problem. And we would say, look, here's what happened, here's what we learned, and here is what the vulnerability was in your agency with that unit, with that person, whatever it was. You need to remediate it because we can't just, you know, keep having this happen again. So I think the fact that DOI stays behind to remediate fixes in city government, and I got to the point of memorializing those and being very methodical about those, giving agencies 30 days to tell me how they were going to fix the issue. And, you know, implemented over 2,200 of those over the 12 years that I was there. And I was very focused on that, fixing the problems and not just continuing the pace with the other 700 cases that we had open at any given time. But I agree with your preface. It is an odd animal, DOI. It's a big agency as compared to other IGs. It's the biggest in the country. Of course, we have a huge workforce of over 300,000 people. But when I started, we had about 350 people. That's a massive IG office, as it were. And so, yes, appointed by the mayor. I did not know Mayor Bloomberg. I went through the same process with the transition team and the selection committee as everybody else. And so I had really, you know, an arm's length relationship, if not any relationship with him at the time. The DOI commissioner was the only commissioner who had to be appointed by the city council. That has now changed. But the reason for that, and then the removal provision as well, that there can be a hearing if the mayor wants to fire the DOI commissioner for obvious reasons rooted in history. DOI commissioner may be onto something that is making the mayor uncomfortable, maybe about the mayor, him or herself. And so you get rid of the DOI commissioner. Statutorily, there is a bump in the road that doesn't allow that. These are all indicia of independence. It's the most important quality that DOI has to have is its independence. Strive to be apolitical and just follow where the evidence leads, regardless, as Mimi said, of whether it's a Democrat or a Republican or whatever the qualities are. Is money sluicing out the door that belongs to the taxpayer from one of our city systems or programs or departments? Is something happening that's dangerous? Somebody is not doing their job or they're engaging in misconduct. They're looking the other way and not doing inspections. And so something's going to fall down and boom and hurt somebody. We would be all over that sort of thing. So yeah, we're inside city government. We're part of city government, but sort of perched up and outside in a very independent watchdog kind of way.
Can DOI proactively launch its own investigations, or does it need a referral from elsewhere?
It can launch its own. It does that every hour of the day. There are no referrals necessary. I cannot imagine doing that job encumbered by the need to have to get a referral from somebody else. That is not to say, and it is distinct from tips and complaints and requests for investigation also came in the door every single day for us to review and evaluate. And I'll join Mimi in saying, you can't run a department like that. You can't be in the public corruption investigation business without reading the newspapers every single day. Before I hit the door very early in the morning, I had read everything that all of you gentlemen had written and your publications had written. And I had already watched you on New York One, Errol, you know, just to absorb, you know, what happened today, what was learned yesterday, what was learned overnight. And so we're self-generating in terms of the cases that we open. There's no need for referrals or permission from anybody.
Okay, now let me bring in Willie and Greg, and I'll start with you, Willie. When it comes to what later became, basically U.S. versus Eric Adams, to the extent that you were following and reporting on related issues, where did you start? What was the issue that led you to think, well, maybe there's something here? Was it the straw donors or was it something else?
Well, I think that, the New York Times, myself, and other outlets, look at a host of different things. When somebody is running for mayor, they're going to get, or in an ideal world, they're going to get a pretty thorough examination. And I think that, a lot of reporters set out to do that during the course of the campaign, with now Mayor Adams and the other leading candidates who were running. So before somebody even takes office, reporters are going to take a pretty aggressive and careful look at their background, their conduct, how they conduct their campaign, what they were involved with in past either elected or other positions they held in the public or private sector. And so, it starts long before somebody says, that looks suspicious, or, once someone's in office. And the investigation of the mayor kind of burst into view with the search of the home of his main campaign fundraiser. So that if we weren't all over it before then, that certainly was a
Well, yeah, that was
large
when
flag.
that's when the flare went up and everybody came running, right? Because I was also curious though about the extent to which there are a lot of journalists who are watching, including some students. I'm curious as to what extent are you routinely doing sort of, for lack of a better word, pattern recognition, looking at campaign finance filings, looking at patterns, who are the big donors, when did, 20 donations come in on the same day and from the same location, and who put that together, that sort of a thing.
Well, I mean, there's a whole host of, as there is when you're covering anything, there is a whole host of information coming in. You observe someone's conduct, you observe their history. I wasn't spending a lot of time looking at campaign finance filings. Maybe we would have taken a different tack earlier had we done that. But they're you see how someone conducted themselves in their previous jobs, and when they get elected, how they conduct themselves, who they surround themselves with. I mean, when the mayor came in, as he built out his administration, he surrounded himself with a number of people who attracted a fair amount of attention, either because of their past conduct, or because of their lack of experience for the positions that they were put in, their lack of other qualifications, and the fact that many of them were very, very close to the mayor. And when you take that and take that all together, it raises a certain number of flags.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. There was at least one deputy mayor who had previously been under investigation. Greg, when when I think about how this story has unfolded, one of the things that really stands out are some of the stories that were done where the city's publishing it. There were investigative reporters, and then there was this partnership with Documented, where there were people going around doing interviews. And Documented, for those who don't know, is a sort of a specialty shop where they focus on the immigrant communities of New York. So there were a number of Mandarin speaking, I believe, journalists who are out talking to people who were just very openly saying things like, "Oh no, I never made that contribution," or "I've never made a contribution in my life. I don't know why my name is on that." How did that partnership come about? And t- did you all initiate that, or was that something that led a lot of interesting information to your desk that wouldn't have made it there otherwise?
That's a lot of questions there, Errol, all at once. Um, Look, before we got to the straw donation stuff, the city was all over Eric Adams for other things because he has this long history going way back to the aqueduct scandal with John Sampson, who would later become a convicted felon, and then his issues with the New York City Police Department, and also just he's the Brooklyn borough president, and nobody really looks at borough presidents. Like they do what they do, and nobody really pays any attention. And if you look at the indictment, U.S. versus Eric Adams, not all of it, but most of it is while he was the borough president. And this Turkish stuff that's going on is going on while he's the borough president. So nobody's really looking at him because he's not the mayor. So once he starts running for mayor, we start looking at him. We did not at first focus on campaign finance. We were focusing on his tax problems and his real estate issues, like does he own the co-op? Did he own the co-op? At one point, he sends us this document in which he claims that he gave shares of a co-op to a friend of his that's undated, not signed by the friend. And we're just like, this guy has like alarm bells going off all around him, and he gets elected. And by the way, after he gets elected after he wins the primary, the money just pours in. And Southern District started this thing in September of 2021. This is before he's the mayor. So, and my point is that there's tons of alarm bells going off with this guy before he became the mayor of the city of New York. And when Alvin Bragg brought his case against Dwayne Montgomery, one of Eric Adams' old cop buddies, who also, by the way, was an intermediary for Eric Adams when he was borough president, another alarm bell going off, and they charge him with the straw donations. We just went to town and we just went back, and because we had seen indications of this stuff where you have this supermarket out in Flushing, or no, under the Manhattan Bridge, where there's like dozens and dozens of workers who are giving $249 all on the same day. So if you when you look at these things, but the problem with it is it's extremely labor intensive. So now you have 45 people who gave $249 in the same day. You have to now start going out and door knocking and try to get people. And in this particular case, they didn't speak English. So that's where Documented comes in, and we're able to get some of them to admit that, well, I didn't write this check. That's not my signature, so on. But Errol, see, this is a problem with these things. That doesn't mean that Eric Adams knows that, and that's what they kept saying over and over and over again. We don't know anything. That's up to the donor. The donor is swearing that it's their money, blah blah blah. And so we can go back and look at John Liu and see the same situation that happened, exactly the same situation that happened with him, except they never got to him. So the difference is that this guy. I mean, they obviously have some people who are cooperating with them and helping them in every possible way. But in terms of the press, I think we tried to, set off alarm bells, and it had no impact. And now everybody is like, "Oh, how come we didn't know about this?" and so on.
Well, yeah, that I will tell you, that is of course a familiar theme with political journalism, right? You put stuff out there that you think is important, and you put it out there because you think it's important, and it kind of gets a big yawn. If the other candidates in the race don't pick up on it, if the other media don't pick up on it, if the public doesn't seem to be particularly moved by it, it kind of comes and goes. I found an interview I did, I think, a few weeks after Eric Adams became borough president, and I was asking him, it's like, why did you go on a 15-day trip to China 2 weeks after you took office? And who paid for it? And I couldn't get, I have the thing, I might post it online. I couldn't get any answers out of him, and this was back in 2014. Mimi Rocha, when you hear something like Greg Smith talking about the kind of reporting that they do, what happens when, or is it a problem for you that journalists are working from a different standard? Like, we're just trying to confirm rumors and nail down a couple of things. Journalists are not worried about rules of evidence or admissibility in court. What do you do when you see an interesting or intriguing piece of reporting that probably can't make its way into court, at least as in the way that you've read it? You have to kind of go back and re-report it?
Look, I mean, I think there is such a give and take, really, between prosecutors and the press. And so I'll summarize it as best I can, which I think responds to your question. We read about things, prosecutors read about things in the press, hear them on the news, as Rose said. We try to digest it. We get leads. We then need to go and investigate, right? I mean, your journalist investigation should not ever substitute for a prosecutor's investigation. And of course, we all have different tools available to us. I mean, we have the power of the grand jury, which in the federal system is even more powerful than it is, at least in New York State, because of the way the grand jury works. But you have sources and anonymous sources and people who will tell you things without fear of ever becoming public. So we have, I think, different paths to getting at what we're all trying to get at, I think, good journalists and good prosecutors, which is the truth and the facts, irrespective of who we're talking about as a target or a subject. I think that is a hugely important tool to prosecutors. And I'll give you two quick examples of cases that I had experience with here as a DA that really came from press leads. One was a case that was reported in the Yonkers Ledger. We have a real desert of national or even beyond hyper-local news here in Westchester, even though we're a county of 1 million people. So I'm definitely making a plug for the New York Times to bring back its Westchester reporting, and anyone who really can do investigative reporting. I think Westchester is very ripe for that, and there is none, or certainly not a lot. And so the Yonkers Ledger did an article in April of 2023, which I have this moment of distinctly remember reading because it was shocking to me as the DA, where it talked about allegations about a high-ranking staffer to the board of legislators here. The chair of the board of legislators, a high-ranking staffer of hers, who was involved allegedly in a child predator type sting operation. I read this, and this is one of those things where you sort of spit your coffee out. Like, what? I'm reading about this in the Yonkers Ledger? How is this the first time hearing about it? And that, let's just fast forward, ended up leading to the Board of Legislators chair having to step down. That was a political thing, not a criminal one. But we did, in our office, announce that we were going to do an investigation of who knew what when, and why hadn't we not heard about this sooner. I then had to close that investigation and refer it to the Southern District of New York, which I also made public, because I found out that someone on my staff actually did know about this allegation, but had not told us. That person obviously is no longer here. But that is a great example. And the Southern District, by the way, ended up very quickly charging this individual with child exploitation. So there was a criminal case, a different type of criminal case made. I would have liked to have been able to pursue the question of who knew what when. And because we don't have a DOI here, and we don't have a very independent prosecutor in the way that Rose was talking about. I mean, my office is funded by the county, and our funding is very much controlled by them. And so we don't have someone to really follow up on things like this. So we rely on the press to shed more light on things like this. So that's one example. And the one other one I would give is in Mount Vernon. Before I took office, there was a very in-depth investigative reporting done by a reporter from the Gothamist, George Joseph. I don't think he's with the Gothamist anymore. And he did a whole series on Mount Vernon Police Department and whistleblowers, secret recordings, and alleged police misconduct. And we did do a series of investigations. We did a public statement about what we were able to glean from that and what we weren't, but it led to us referring the Mount Vernon Police Department to DOJ Civil Rights for a pattern and practice investigation, which has not yet, to my knowledge, been concluded. And it also led to exonerations for 27 individuals who had previously been convicted in the Mount Vernon Police Department narcotics sweeps. So, I mean, these are just two examples where we got leads from the press, but also where we rely on the press. There's a lot of conduct, especially in the public corruption scenario, that we cannot charge. It's awful but lawful, as they say. And I frankly look, is the press, and we're hamstrung at what we can say for ethical reasons, grand jury reasons. And, it's really my hope that the press carries those forward, though, and shines light on them, even when there are not charges that we can bring, which was your original question. Sorry for the long answer.
No, that's great. And now, and Rose, I mean, to the extent that as you mentioned, DOI makes recommendations about ways to sort of either close loopholes or create best practices so that agencies won't have the same problems in the future that they've had in the past. Apply that, I guess, in a more political context, meaning when it comes to, say, campaign finance violations, when it comes to kickbacks, extortion, other forms of fraud within government. Are there recommendations yet to be made? I would think that we've almost seen every conceivable flavor of wrongdoing over the years, but yet there still remains things that can be done?
I'm sure there is. It is a never-ending, almost whack-a-mole, battle. If you're at DOI. One quick story that involves a relationship between the press and DOI taking action and sweeping reform has to do with a case that Tom Robbins was aware of at the Housing Development Corporation. This came crashing through the door when I walked in to the DOI office. Tom knew that the then head of HDC, quasi city-state agency, was treating the agency like his piggy bank and engaging in a lavish personal social life and whirlwind using the money and personnel and cars, etc. of that agency. Tom, this is before I became DOI commissioner, I was still in the Southern District, was issuing FOIL requests to HDC. The FOIL requests were, when I read them a couple months later, were the tea leaves of the wrongdoing that was going on. The problem for Tom is that he was issuing the FOIL requests to the very perpetrator who was engaging in the activity. And so that agency had instructed his general counsel and others at the department to deep six those FOIL requests until they were literally thrown in the trash when Tom put them in there. And so then there was a change in administration, new mayor, new DOI commissioner. And Tom came to me immediately and said, this is what I've been trying to get at, and this is what I have, et cetera, et cetera. We opened up an investigation, and to make a long story short, the head of the agency was investigated, indicted, convicted of everything Tom had found, and then some. And the board was swept because it too had indicators that there was wrongdoing going on and nothing was done. Nobody else was charged, but a new board was brought in at our recommendation. And then it turned out that DOI was technically not the IG for HDC because it was half city, half state. And the state IG really wasn't the IG. And so what I learned is that DOI and the state IG both thought the other one was looking at HDC, and at the end of the day, nobody was. And so, and then there was a fear factor. People, I guess, were concerned about coming forward to DOI. There was some relationships in place with this agency head and the administration that made people very fearful about coming forward to DOI, and so nobody did until there was a change in administration. And you know, I probably should have put Tom on the payroll for that one. When the indictment came down, I suggested to the U.S. Attorney's Office that in some of the speaking indictment terminology, that they start with the fact that the agency was destroying FOIL requests that were being made by Tom Robbins. And I think to this day, I think I'm right, the indictment does reference that connection between the press investigation and ultimately a federal felony investigation that brought down 2 people and a board and other measures that were taken about accountability and accounting and report outs by that department that had not existed. So that's one example of many, but there was another whole area that we uncovered involving discretionary funds, which are funds that, as you know, the city council receives to provide to their constituents in their respective areas. And the accountability on those discretionary dollars, it turned out, was pretty porous. And I did 1 and then 2 and then 3 cases involving elected officials who had control of discretionary funds, and those funds going to friends and family program type, not even real recipients, nonprofits recipients. And the money was being wasted because it was supposed to really go to senior citizens and after school programs and things. But everybody had learned that the lack of oversight on it meant you could really give it to anybody and do anything with it. So I think after the 3rd case, I formed an entire new unit. I went to City Hall and I said, I need more head count because I want to stand up a new unit called the nonprofit, city-funded nonprofit fraud unit. Opened up a unit, and it, you know, to this day, I think it's their busiest unit. But there was all kinds of great reform that was done collaboratively with the city council, I might add, and the mayor's office of contract services to put checks and balances in on the front end during these grants, and then accounting after those sorts of grants are issued through discretionary funding process. And I think as a result of that unit being opened up and tapping into that vein of, quite frankly, corruption vulnerability, I think we investigated and ultimately had prosecuted 5 or 6 elected officials. Most of them were city, but 1 or 2 were state, because when a state official has an approval mechanism and authority to approve something, they too were getting in on the action with some of these nonprofits and were engaging in wrongdoing. So we put a whole new, much better system in place that everybody had to behave better when it came to those dollars.
Yeah, I remember some of those cases where, you know, there'd be joint shopping trip between the assembly member and the council member, and they'd kind of grab the money together. I want to ask Greg and then Willie to do something. They're investigative reporters. I'll ask them to be political journalists for a minute, because while it's not the topic of today's conversation, it's major news. How do you think the election of Donald Trump and the appointment of a new U.S. attorney in the Southern District change or even reset the table with respect to U.S. versus Eric Adams? We'll start with you, Greg.
Well, I actually wrote about this. So the deal that technically, the Department of Justice, I understand, could just pull a plug. And again, the timing of this is really kind of a trip because they're fighting about which date in April, but April is really not that far away, and Trump comes in January 20th. It takes time to put a new Southern District attorney in there because they have to go through the Senate confirmation process. So I mean, I don't think that's really a factor because if you're starting a trial in April, even if they were somehow able to shoehorn this guy in, there still has to be another aspect to this, which is you still would have to go into court and say to the judge, and we're going to withdraw this case or for a specific reason. You have to say a reason. Now, the reason could just be incredibly vague. In the interests of justice. But all of this stuff takes a certain amount of time. So it seems to me like that this thing is just, and I know that it's still just full speed ahead because they just keep dropping the discovery material, and they're now arguing about like Brady versus Giglio and when this stuff gets in and so on. So as far as I can tell, nothing has really changed. But something could suddenly just like everything could come screeching to a halt, and Pam Bondi could just say, "We're not doing this." But all of that would have to take place in the public, so we get to see what's their thinking and why would they do this. The only other part of this, though, is that why would he do this? Because he's got other things that he wants to do first, right? I mean, he's got to get rid of the cases against him, or he has to put people in place first that he has control over that can do these things, such as Deep Six, Eric Adams prosecution, and that takes a certain amount of time.
Okay, what's your sense of that, Willie?
I do, I think Greg is right in terms of bringing an end to the prosecution. But if I'm not mistaken, I think that Trump could just, with the stroke of a pen, pardon him in advance of any trial. He could pardon him for the conduct for which he's charged in the pending case. He could issue him a broader pardon should he so choose. It's unclear why, we don't know what's in Trump's mind. We don't know why he might or might not want to do that. But as a political reporter, Errol, I think you could come up with a fair number of reasons why that might be beneficial to Trump, to his party. So it's it's a bit of a black box right now. I do think that just watching the mayor's behavior during the campaign, observing his statements and his conduct since the election, certainly raises questions as to whether that might not be on his mind.
Yeah, I would say just on that topic, by the way, Willie, to not overthink it. If you're a real estate developer in New York, it never hurts to have a mayor who owes you a favor or two. Mimi, I wanted to ask you on the question of the fairness of investigations. We've seen for a lot of different reasons in multiple cases, officials having their phones seized, having their records seized, and so forth. And as you know, as an elected official, it can be politically damaging to even be under investigation, even if nothing comes of it. How as a prosecutor do you balance fairness with the need to investigate?
That's a great question. Look, I think every responsible prosecutor, and I'll say that's most prosecutors that I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with, take that into account, take that obligation about balancing fairness and the need to investigate very seriously. So on the one hand, I said at the beginning that if you're in the public eye in some respect, there's going to be more scrutiny on you. There's going to be more leads out there for prosecutors to look at and see. But in making a decision about whether to go forward with an investigation, and this is true when I say public figures, I don't just mean people that who would, everyone would recognize their name. I mean, police officers, for example. We get complaints about police officers. I've reviewed probably over 100 in my time here, more than that. And yet we've only brought charges against a handful. And that's not because I'm hesitant to bring charges where they're warranted, but because we have to acknowledge that a lot of times there either are charges, there is information out there about people, police officers, elected officials, public servants in a library, for example, who work in a library. We had a case against a woman, a fraud case. But the information that's out there has to be thoroughly investigated, often using the grand jury tool, which then makes what we have found or not found secret. If it leads to charges, then obviously, it was warranted. Sometimes it doesn't lead to charges, but we can't explain why. And so that could be one of the more damaging things, both for the prosecutor, frankly, who people don't understand, well, why didn't you bring charges? And that's one of the hardest parts I think about this job, is not being able to explain why you aren't doing something, but also for that public official. And so it has to be a consideration. It's why at DOJ, for public integrity type investigations, there are all sorts of pre-approvals that you have to get, not just because it's often elected officials, but because of the damage that can be done. And one other thing I'll say is the timing of announcing investigations or charges can be very complicated for prosecutors. I've seen prosecutors struggle with this. There's an election coming up. Is it our obligation as a prosecutor to tell someone, to tell the public ahead of time what we know, but we're not ready to bring charges? Or do we wait until that person is elected? You all were touching on this with Eric Adams. It happened in the case of Malcolm Smith a few years ago, state senator. There have been many examples of this. And so I think it's both whether to investigate and also when to announce that investigation, the charges or lack of charges, which is incredibly sensitive and difficult for prosecutors to be able to do.
Let me remind folks, if you have a question for this panel, we're going to urge you to use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen and just key in whatever question you've got and direct it towards somebody in particular or to the panel as a whole. And we'll invite you to join the conversation momentarily. And then maybe talk a little bit about the very tricky question of why do you think the Southern District indicted the mayor of New York City, as opposed to, once you read through the indictment, you realize there's a whole host of people who are involved here, right? If there's extortion, if there's conspiracy, if there's wire fraud, even just reading through it, it seems like there are a number of people who may have engaged in wrongdoing. Why start at the top? We as journalists have been accustomed to or seen many cases where you start with a small fry, maybe you get their cooperation, you start to build a case, and then the summit of it, somewhere down the road, is the top elected official, whereas this looks like the opposite.
That's a tricky question for me to answer without, really knowing more about the inside of their case, which I don't. I will say as a general matter, though, if you're going to go right to charging the mayor of New York City, which obviously in all the ways that we've discussed here today is a very big deal, you are going to have strong evidence, whatever the form of that evidence. So often we start at the bottom, whatever kind of case it is, a narcotics case, a public corruption case, a fraud case, but we start with the lower level people when we have to, when we need to work our way up the chain. So again, while I don't know the specifics of their evidence in this case, I would say if that was the decision that was made, they have the, the goods, so to speak. They must have strong evidence directly against the mayor such that they felt they didn't really have a choice. As I said earlier, I don't think this was a easy decision. I mean, I've never spoken to Damien, let me be clear, about this case, but knowing him and how the office works, I am sure it was not an easy decision to bring this case. But sometimes you're faced with a case that, or evidence that you can't look away from, you can't turn away from. And I think it is so important. I can't stress this theme enough, as Rose, talked about a little bit, the independence of prosecutors. It's something I deeply believe in. I think it's easier in some prosecutors' offices to be independent, meaning independent of any political party. It doesn't matter if you were elected, if you're appointed, and which party we're talking about. You should be able to evaluate evidence fairly and objectively. And so it seems to me that must be, I'm using my inferential abilities here, must be what happened in the Southern District with respect to the mayor.
Okay. Another reminder to use your Q&A function. There's a question here, and I'm going to ask Rose Gill to answer it. The question is, how concerned should the current DOI commissioner be about the next budget, given DOI's role in the Adams investigation? And I'm interpreting that in part as a question about the independence of the office from a budgetary standpoint.
Classic question. There is a tried and true answer, which is I would not expect the current DOI commissioner's budget to be cut this year in this next budget go round at all. I wouldn't necessarily she shouldn't hold her breath for a big increase either. But other than all agencies sometimes get the same cut, say 3% peg that every agency gets, and DOI, certainly when I was there, had to take the same peg sometimes as every other agency did. But other than that sort of routine, it is happening to everyone at the same level because we have a gap to fill. That would be really the only justification for a cut to Jocelyn's budget this year. I think anything else should bring Willie Roshbaum and Greg and you and everybody else to the battlefield. If DOI's budget was to be cut again precipitously or something outside the realm of routine, but routine peg at this moment in time, and I don't expect that would happen.
And Rose, when you were DOI commissioner, to what extent is this commissioner sort of specifically not part of quote unquote the team? Like, did you go to cabinet meetings? Did you, sort of routinely interact with your fellow commissioners?
No, I did not go to cabinet meetings. My predecessors went to cabinet meetings with Mayor Giuliani and Mayor Bloomberg, and I stopped that practice. So no, I did not go to cabinet meetings. I could mount a sliver of an argument that being at some of those cabinet meetings sometimes would be awfully helpful to me as a fly on the wall. But in the main, 99% of the reason was justified that I not go to those cabinet meetings, because that's not who I am. It's not who the DOI commissioner is, should not be sitting in cabinet meetings the way the other commissioners and deputy mayors were doing that. That's the outside, sort of perch that I talked about before. So look, the goal was to, stay on the line of not being, too buddy-buddy with people, not, necessarily socializing with people, not going to cabinet meetings. On the other hand, I met regularly with my fellow commissioners to talk about the problems that they were facing or to talk about the problems that I was seeing that were happening in their departments. Those were business meetings. And so I had interaction. I felt there was a line to stay on the right side of that was a not too close kind of a line to walk.
Here's a question. I'll ask Willie to answer this. Did the press really vet Adams appropriately before the 2021 Democratic primary? As I recall, the Times had one article referencing the New York State IG inquiry that questioned his honesty.
I don't have the stories in front of me, but I do think there was more than one, and there was a couple of deep dives, I think, including looking at some of his past conduct, both in the Senate as Brooklyn Borough President. I know that we did a lot of scrubbing of allegations from when he was in the police department. Frankly, sitting here, I don't recall how much of that actually rose to the level of getting into the paper or being a story in and of itself. But there certainly was a lot of work done by several of my colleagues, and I was involved to a degree, but not. I wasn't one of the. It was mostly done at that point by a couple of other reporters.
There's always a lot of lore and gossip around this, so I know you've heard this before. But when you're moving a story forward, like the case against Eric Adams, do you need to, or do you actually end up arguing with and arguing for space, like telling your editor, "This is big. This needs to go on the front page"?
I'm so old and I've been doing this so long. I don't spend a lot of time arguing where how much play something should get, although I do from time to time. But this case is one. We're talking about the mayor of the city of New York being charged with some serious crimes. So I don't think we've had trouble bringing to bear resources in terms of reporters and time and other resources at all. Our editors are interested, have a very healthy interest in the story at a time when there's a whole lot of news going on. And just to be clear, I don't always agree with my editors, so I'm not just praising them in a knee-jerk way. But I don't think we've had to fight to get attention for the story.
I mean, and not to say that it was intentional, but I mean, one thing about it being U.S. versus Eric Adams is it makes that conversation a lot more clear, right? As opposed to saying, well, this is the mayor's best friend, or this is the mayor's, top aide, or this is the mayor's main fundraiser. Now you can say this is the mayor himself.
Right, but I also think that another factor, one could argue that another factor driving this is because he has surrounded himself with people who, whether it's a lack of qualifications or past missteps, and the mayor has said that he believes in second chances, and I think that's a good thing, but because of the people that he brought into his administration, I think that made the eventual indictment of the mayor an even bigger story, because it sort of it was something that people were wondering about or expecting or asking about. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, I got a related impact story, a question for you, Greg. I remember seeing you at the press conference that Damian Williams held when they, I think they simultaneously busted something like 80 janitors in the housing authority. Massive kind of kickback scheme.
70, just 70.
Only 70, right? Right. Well, they said it was the biggest one day, civil fraud investigation of that type or something like that, or simultaneous indictment in the history of the Department of Justice. But I remember what Damian Williams said was that they had made a couple of smaller cases. The conduct continued, so then they went and rounded up everybody. What has been the fallout from that? I mean, they did about as good of a job at quote unquote selling that to the press as you could do. I mean, I sat down and I had a one-on-one with him. We led our broadcast with it that night. You guys had a lot of reporting on it. It's not like it didn't, at the same time, it seems to have just kind of come and gone.
Sure. I can tell you what's happened if just to just start with that,
Sure.
which is that they've got plea deals from 40 of them, something like that. 2 of them went to trial, convicted instantly. There's a handful of other ones that they're in talks with. And, none of these people work at the housing authority anymore. But to me, the issue has always been the same thing. The housing authority is a great example of what both Mimi and Rose have been talking about, which is when you have a lack of oversight, more stuff happens. It's as simple as that. I mean, there's nothing more complicated than if you like Tom Robbins' situation with Russell Harding is there's nobody looking. And when you have nobody looking, what's going to happen? And what I remember happening with this thing was that I was interacting with some people. People call me up. I've covered the housing authority for God knows how long. And people call me up and they tell me, oh, yeah, this guy's shaking down this guy and this guy's shaking down this guy. And it's kind of happenstance. It's like, I don't know. But then it became really clear to me that this is going on everywhere. And the way that it became clear to me was that I was able to get a database of all of these, what they call micro contracts, which are just below 5,000 and then ultimately just below 10,000. And the point of that is if you go above 5 or above 10, you automatically have to enter into this new competitive bidding process that's public. So this stuff stays off the radar because it's done on the development at the development level so that nobody really sees it unless you look at the same contractor getting 25 of these $5,000 contracts within a 3-month period. What is that? I mean, it's incredibly obvious. And so to the Southern District's finally, to the Southern District's credit, they went back and they started to look at this pattern. And DOI had done not 1, but 2 of these cases. The first one they did was just like a couple of, they banged the contractor. They didn't go after the employee. And then the second one, they did both, but it was very small. It was like it's a one-off. And so nobody pays attention to that. And it's not until you see the pattern, which is very easy to see, that's why you get 70 people. They could have done more, by the way. I don't know why they did just 70. And because this was going on absolutely everywhere. And that gets me back to the point I was trying to make in the first place, which is that the development level staff had figured out that nobody was watching. And that's crucial. Once you do that, off to the races.
One thought, Errol, if I could, is just to add to what Greg said, is that, at the end of the day, and this is sort of implicit in what Greg said, but at the end of the day, it's about deterrence and the one-offs and going after the contractors are not going to deter the conduct by the employees. I guess it remains to be seen whether, indicting 70 or so people will have a deterrent effect. I'd be surprised if it didn't, but you never know. But time will tell. I mean, the other thing is I just noticed, this morning, the Southern District, they put out a advisory every morning about what they believe are cases of interest. And, there's a trial going, another trial going on now, and 2 people are getting sentenced today. So the drumbeat of it kind of continues.
Okay, that is good to know, and we probably ought to report more of those, sort of follow-ups. This is a question for you, Willie. I would have asked it myself, but somebody else did. What advice do you have on building sources in law enforcement agencies such as DOI, prosecutors' offices, the FBI, et cetera?
The without going into too much detail, at least the way that I do my job has changed a lot over the years, and less and less information, in my experience, comes from the government in investigations like this, to the point where it's almost nil, despite the beliefs of some folks. But when my colleagues who teach at institutions like the one co-sponsoring this event have the poor judgment to put me in front of their students, what I tell them is that the best way to develop sources is to be fair to people, and to be completely assiduous in terms of accuracy, and to go the last mile to try and get both sides to talk to you, and to show compassion, and you're the author of your own reputation, so to speak, and every story that you write, if people are reading it, will inure to your benefit. I would talk to everybody that you can talk to, and it sounds like a really dopey thing, but a lot of people find the press to be brusque and impolite and rude and self-centered, and there's probably some truth to that. Reporters are always in a hurry, they always want something, but saying please and thank you and treating people well, and it sounds sort of simplistic and even Pollyanna-ish, but it goes a long way.
Hey, Errol, I think there was a point in that question about developing sources. I took it to mean inside DOI or inside a prosecutor's office. So that's tricky. And I agree with everything Willie said, and that's always the way he conducted himself, as far as I could see. But this is a different issue about cultivating an insider at a DOI or at a prosecutor's office, and having been at both places, I can tell you that the first thing that you are told is that there are press offices in both of those offices, and they are the ones who communicate with the press. Line assistants, line investigators who are in possession of grand jury information, wiretap information, search warrant information, and other confidential information may not just, on their own, be talking to reporters about what they know to be the guts of, legally mandated confidential information. And so that's, I'm just lifting that flag that there are very strict rules about speaking to the press. And so to the extent that this question is, how do we develop inside sources at a DOI or a DA's office or a US attorney's office, that's tricky for that person who you're cultivating for those reasons.
Yeah. And I'm assuming that question may have come from a journalism student. I would just also emphasize that you can have what you would consider a source. You can tell your editor you have a source, but also have the kind of a completely professional above board relationship where you're not going to ask them for information they can't give you, and they're not going to give you information that you can't see, but they're still a source. And they can tell you things, depending on what it is, it could be as important as, hey, keep tomorrow clear, something our office is going to be putting out a press release tomorrow. That's an important piece of information that doesn't violate any law, but that's what having a good source can also mean for you.
Just to add one more thing, Errol, the universe of people who have access to certain kinds of information is a lot broader than many people think. And I'm not just talking about defense lawyers who have access to certain kinds of information, but in the court system, in the criminal justice system, there is a very wide, or much wider than, I should say, much wider than is generally thought, a much wider universe of people who have access to different kinds of information. And that's always a way to confirm things, to get context, to be able to kind of paint a broader picture. And reporters are always in a rush, as I said, but it's always important to talk to everyone that you can, because sometimes it's surprising where information will be found or will come from.
Very true.
Yeah,
And
you
always
have to, you have to try. I mean, I agree. And these gentlemen and many others did. And I will lift up for the students and others who were on this call. Occasionally, we would correct things that we were seeing. And so you would get us to talk to you, correcting things or being able to put things out during an investigation where we thought it was important. Deep important public interest, something big, had happened. So you do have to try if you're a journalist, and you try 5 times and you'll probably succeed twice or 3 times and get something.
Yeah. And look, as I tell my students as a general rule of thumb, always talk with a lawyer when you're trying to sort of frame these cases and understand exactly what some of the terminology means, so that you don't get stuff wrong. And I've had people really set me straight on a number of different things, just procedurally, differences between state and federal prosecutions. What does it mean to issue a target letter? Who actually gets those? Is that really a thing? It was really, really very helpful to get guidance from folks. We're coming down to our last couple of minutes. I wanted to put Mimi Roca on the spot a little bit because you're changing jobs at the end of the month. What will you be doing as you leave as Westchester District Attorney?
I truly do not know. I've been trying to think of the best thing I can make up to give a creative answer to that, and I came up with Dancing with the Stars. I don't know. I am not leaving to go do something else. I'm leaving because I thought that running again was not right for me. But I'll figure that out on the other side. So I'm sorry to give an unsatisfactory answer to which is a fair on the spot question. So I'll go with Dancing with the Stars for right now.
So this is the first and only office you've run for?
Correct.
Okay, yep, it's not for everybody. I got it. Absolutely. Listen, that brings us to the end of our time. I want to thank our guests, Mimi Roca, Rose Gill, Greg Smith, and William Rashbaum for a great and informative discussion. This case is not going away. Neither are any of the people you see on your screen. We'll all continue to follow this from different angles. And I want to thank you all so much for joining us in the audience.
Thanks, Errol.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Errol.
Okay. I believe this will all be posted online if Vital City follows their usual practices. So everyone who attended, please watch for that as well. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great day.
You too.